The bathroom door wouldn't budge. I stood there in my own hallway, pressing my knees together like a child, while my 34-year-old son's voice carried through the wood. "Mom, you know the rules. Ask nicely." My bladder was screaming. My dignity was drowning. And in that moment, I realized I'd become a prisoner in the house I'd owned for 23 years. What Marcus didn't know was that I'd been quietly preparing for this conversation for months, and his business loan, the one keeping his precious contracting company afloat, was coming up for renewal in 2 weeks. I never imagined I'd be standing in my own home, a 67-year-old woman who'd raised 3 children and buried a husband, reduced to begging for basic human dignity. But that's exactly where I found myself last October, and the path that led me there was paved with small compromises that felt like love at the time, but turned out to be the building blocks of my own imprisonment. It started innocently enough, the way these things always do. Marcus had been struggling after his divorce. Jennifer had taken half of everything, including his confidence, and when he asked if he could move back home just temporarily while he got his contracting business off the ground, how could I say no? He was my baby, my youngest, the one who'd always been a little lost, a little too dependent, but also the one who could make me laugh until my sides hurt when he was in a good mood. He'd been living in a studio apartment that smelled like desperation and microwave dinners, and I had this big empty house that echoed with memories of better times. "It'll just be 6 months, Mom," he'd said, standing in my kitchen with that little boy-lost expression that had been getting him out of trouble since he was 5. "Just until I can get a few big contracts and save up for a deposit on a decent place." He was wearing his work clothes, paint-splattered jeans and a t-shirt with more holes than fabric, and I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of failure sitting heavy on his shoulders. My heart broke for him, the way it always had when any of my children were hurting. That was 18 months ago. The first few months were actually pleasant. Marcus would make me coffee in the morning before he left for job sites, and we'd sit at the kitchen table going over his accounts, me helping him organize his paperwork and understand the business side of things. I'd spent 30 years managing the household finances while Paul was alive, and I knew my way around spreadsheets and tax forms. Marcus seemed genuinely grateful for the help, calling me his business partner and joking that he should put me on the payroll. We fell into a comfortable routine. He'd work during the day, I'd handle his calls and scheduling, and evenings we'd watch old movies together on the couch like we did when he was a teenager. But comfort, I've learned, can be a dangerous thing. It lulls you into accepting situations that should have warning bells attached, and by the time you notice the water rising, you're already in over your head. The changes started small. Marcus began leaving his tools scattered around the living room, saying he needed them handy for early morning jobs. Then it was paint cans in the hallway, drop cloths draped over my furniture, ladders leaning against walls I'd just had repainted. When I mentioned that maybe he could store his work things in the garage, he got that wounded look and said, "Mom, I'm working 16-hour days trying to build something here. I need my equipment accessible. You want me to succeed, don't you?" Of course I wanted him to succeed. What mother doesn't want her child to thrive? So I said nothing when my tidy home started looking like a construction site, when I had to navigate around sawhorses to get to my own refrigerator, when the smell of paint thinner became as familiar as my morning coffee. The real shift happened gradually, so slowly that I didn't notice until it was too late. Marcus started making suggestions about the house. Practical suggestions, he called them. The guest bathroom needed updating anyway, he said, so why didn't he renovate it as practice for client jobs? I could use the master bathroom while he worked on it. The kitchen could use new cabinets. He'd do it at cost, just materials, as a gift to me. The living room walls were looking dated. He could repaint them in something more modern. Each project made sense in isolation. Each one came with the promise of improving my home while giving him portfolio pieces for his business, and each one left me with less and less access to my own space while he worked. The guest bathroom renovation stretched from 2 weeks to 2 months, with mysterious delays and supply problems that always seemed to require just a little more patience from me. It was during the kitchen cabinet project that I first heard the phrase that would come to define the lowest point of my life. "Mom, you need to ask nicely." I'd been trying to make myself a sandwich for lunch, reaching around sawdust and power tools scattered across my counters, when I realized I couldn't find the bread knife. I'd looked through the few available drawers, checked the dish drainer, even looked in the living room in case it had been moved during the general chaos of ongoing construction. "Marcus," I'd called, "do you know where my bread knife is?" He'd looked up from the cabinet he was installing, a frown creasing his forehead like I'd just asked him to solve calculus. Mom, I'm trying to concentrate here. Can you ask me nicely? I'd laughed, thinking he was joking. Please, Marcus, could you tell me where my bread knife is? That's better, he'd said, going back to his work. I think it's in the toolbox. I was using it to scrape off old caulk. The bread knife, my bread knife, the one my mother had given me as a wedding gift, was being used as a construction tool. But I pushed down the irritation, told myself that these were just the temporary inconveniences of home improvement, that soon I'd have a beautiful new kitchen, and Marcus would move on to his own place. Except Marcus didn't move on. Each completed project led to another one that needed to be done. The bathroom was finished, but now the hallway looked shabby by comparison. The kitchen was beautiful, but it made the living room seem dated. There was always another improvement needed, another reason why he couldn't quite move out yet, another month or two of temporary inconvenience. And somewhere in the midst of all this helpful renovation, the house had stopped feeling like mine. I started noticing it in small ways first. I'd reach for a dish and find the cabinet rearranged to Marcus's preferences. I'd go to sit in my favorite chair and find it covered with his work papers. I'd want to watch the evening news and discover he'd scheduled a work call in the living room, so could I please find somewhere else to be for the next hour? The ask nicely rule started applying to more and more of my requests. Could I please ask nicely if I wanted him to move his materials so I could vacuum? Could I please ask nicely if I wanted to use the kitchen during hours he'd designated for project planning? Could I please ask nicely if I wanted to have friends over while he was working on sensitive client proposals? I found myself tiptoeing around my own home, weighing whether my needs were important enough to warrant interrupting his work, measuring my words carefully to make sure they came out properly deferential. I was 67 years old, a woman who'd run a household, raised 3 children, managed a husband's medical crisis and death, and somehow I'd been reduced to asking permission to exist in my own space. But the bathroom situation, that was the final straw, the moment that crystallized everything that was wrong with what my life had become. Marcus had decided that the master bathroom needed a complete overhaul too. This wasn't a discussion or a suggestion. It was simply announced one morning over coffee. He'd already ordered materials, he said, already cleared his schedule for the next month to focus on it. It would be his showcase piece, the project that would get him the high-end residential clients he'd been targeting. But where am I supposed to? I'd started to ask. There's the guest bathroom, he'd said, not looking up from his phone where he was scrolling through supply websites. I know it's smaller, but it's only temporary. The guest bathroom. The one with the shower that barely fit a person my size. The one with the medicine cabinet that stuck. The one with water pressure that felt like a gentle summer rain. But I'd nodded, because what else could I do? This was temporary. Everything was always temporary. Except then the guest bathroom lock started acting up. Old house, Marcus explained. Old hardware. He'd fix it soon, but in the meantime he'd installed a simple hook-and-eye latch on the outside. For privacy, he said, so no one would accidentally walk in while I was using it. A hook-and-eye latch. On the outside of the door. I should have seen it then, should have understood what was happening. But I was still thinking like a mother, still believing that my son had my best interests at heart, still trusting that this was all somehow normal and temporary and would resolve itself if I just remained patient a little longer. The morning it all came crashing down was a Tuesday in October. I'd woken up with an urgent need to use the bathroom, not unusual for a woman my age, and padded down the hallway in my robe and slippers. The hook-and-eye latch was fastened shut. I knocked softly. Marcus? I need to use the bathroom. No answer. I knocked a little louder. Marcus, are you in there? Still nothing. I pressed my ear to the door and heard the shower running. He was taking one of his long showers, the kind that used up all the hot water and left the bathroom looking like a steam room. These could last 30 or 40 minutes. My need was becoming desperate. I tried the handle again, even though I knew it was useless with the latch secured from the outside. I thought about going upstairs to the master bathroom, but Marcus had removed the toilet the day before as part of his renovation timeline. I thought about going outside to the little shed in the backyard, but it was raining and I was in my robe and slippers. So I waited. I stood in the hallway, shifting from foot to foot, pressing my knees together, feeling like a child who'd waited too long to ask for permission. 20 minutes passed, 25, 30. Finally, the shower stopped. I heard Marcus moving around, taking his time with whatever post-shower routine he'd developed. Another 10 minutes passed before the latch finally clicked open, and he emerged in a cloud of steam, fully dressed and looking surprised to see me standing there. Oh, hey, Mom. Did you need something? The casual tone, the innocent expression, the complete lack of awareness or concern for the fact that I'd been standing there for 40 minutes in obvious distress, it all hit me like a physical blow. I need to use the bathroom, I said, my voice tight with the effort of controlling both my bladder and my temper. Well, you should have said something, he said, moving past me toward the kitchen. You know you just need to ask nicely. Ask nicely for access to a bathroom in my own home. After 40 minutes of waiting like a servant outside the quarters, she wasn't allowed to enter without permission. Something shifted inside me in that moment, something fundamental and irreversible. I saw myself clearly for the first time in months. A woman who'd been systematically isolated and controlled in her own home, who'd been trained to ask permission for basic human needs, who'd been so thoroughly gaslit that she'd convinced herself this was normal, this was loving, this was what families do for each other. I used the bathroom, and while I sat there in the steamy aftermath of my son's leisurely shower, surrounded by his toiletries that had completely taken over the small space, I started thinking, really thinking, for the first time in months. How had I gotten here? When had I stopped being the homeowner and become the inconvenient houseguest? When had my loving, struggling son become someone who controlled my most basic activities and needs? But more importantly, and this was the thought that would change everything, what was I going to do about it? I'd spent 18 months being patient, being understanding, being supportive. I'd given up my space, my routines, my comfort, my autonomy. I told myself it was temporary, that it was helping him get back on his feet, that this was what good mothers do. But good mothers don't enable their children to become tyrants. Good mothers don't sacrifice their own dignity to feed their children's sense of entitlement. And good mothers definitely don't allow their adult children to treat them like prisoners in their own homes. As I washed my hands in the sink that now held more of Marcus's products than mine, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, more than tired. I looked defeated. When had that happened? When had the strong woman who'd managed a household and raised 3 children and nursed a dying husband become this diminished creature who begged for bathroom privileges? I thought about Paul then, about what he would say if he could see me now. Paul, who died 3 years ago after a long battle with lung cancer, who'd spent his final months telling me how strong I was, how proud he was of the woman I'd always been, how important it was that I never let anyone diminish me after he was gone. Promise me, he'd whispered during one of our last conversations. Promise me you won't let anyone make you smaller than you are. You're too good for that, Eleanor. Too strong for that. I'd promised. But somehow, in trying to be a good mother, I'd forgotten how to be a good woman. I'd forgotten that nurturing doesn't mean self-erasure, that love doesn't require the sacrifice of basic dignity. But I was remembering now, and with that memory came something I hadn't felt in months. Anger. Not the helpless frustration I'd been carrying around, but clean, clear, purposeful anger. The kind of anger that doesn't destroy. It builds. It plans. It acts. I left the bathroom and walked straight to my bedroom, where I pulled out the lockbox I kept in the back of my closet. Inside were documents Marcus had never seen, financial statements he didn't know existed, information that would have surprised him greatly if he'd bothered to think about his mother as anything other than a convenient landlord and unpaid secretary. Paul and I had been careful with money, very careful. We'd bought this house with a substantial down payment and paid it off early. We'd invested wisely, lived below our means, and planned for a comfortable retirement. When Paul died, he'd left me with a house worth $400,000, investment accounts totaling nearly $600,000, and a pension that covered all my living expenses with money left over. I was not, as Marcus seemed to assume, a helpless widow dependent on his support and grateful for his presence. I was a financially secure woman who'd been generous enough to offer free housing to her struggling son, and foolish enough to let that generosity be mistaken for desperation. But Marcus didn't know any of this. In his mind, I was probably just scraping by on Social Security, grateful to have him around to help with household maintenance and repairs. He'd never asked about my finances, never wondered how I managed to pay for groceries and utilities and his endless construction supplies. He'd simply assumed I needed him more than he needed me, and I'd never corrected that assumption. That was about to change. I pulled out my laptop and began making some calls. First to my attorney, James Morrison, who'd handled Paul's estate and still managed some of my legal affairs. Then to my financial advisor, Patricia Chen, who'd been helping me navigate my investments since Paul's death. And finally to my bank, where I'd maintained accounts for over 20 years and had developed relationships with several of the loan officers. The conversations were illuminating, more illuminating than I'd expected. "Mrs. Davidson," James said when I explained my situation, "I'm not sure Marcus understands the legal implications of what he's doing. You're describing conditions that could be considered elder abuse, even if they're being imposed by a family member, controlling someone's access to basic facilities, restricting their movement in their own home. These are serious concerns." Patricia was even more direct. "Eleanor, you've been essentially subsidizing an adult child's life and business to the tune of thousands of dollars per month in free housing, utilities, food, and labor. That's a significant financial gift that you have every right to discontinue whenever you choose." But it was the call to the bank that proved most interesting. "Mrs. Davidson," said Carol Williams, the commercial loan officer I dealt with for years, "I'm actually familiar with your son's business loan. We've been working with him for about 18 months now, and I have to say his account has been challenging. He's been late on several payments, and he's requested extensions twice. We've been accommodating because of his family connection to you. You're one of our most valued long-term customers, but honestly, we've been concerned about the loan's viability." "What do you mean?" Yevgeny I asked, though I was beginning to suspect. "Well, his business projections have been consistently optimistic compared to his actual revenue. The loan was approved partly based on character references, including yours, and partly based on his claims about upcoming contracts that haven't materialized as expected. We're actually scheduled to review his account next month for the annual renewal." "And what does that review typically involve?" "We'll be looking at his payment history, current cash flow, business prospects, and any collateral or guarantees. Honestly, Mrs. Davidson, without some significant improvement in his business performance or additional financial backing, the renewal could be challenging." After I hung up, I sat in my bedroom for a long time processing what I'd learned. Marcus's business was struggling more than he'd let on. His loan was in jeopardy, and the bank had been making accommodations partly because of their relationship with me. It was like discovering I'd been holding the key to my own prison cell all along. I spent the next 3 days quietly researching and planning. I learned about tenant rights and eviction procedures. I researched business loan requirements and personal guarantees. I reviewed my homeowner's insurance and liability coverage, and I had several more conversations with James Morrison about my legal options and protections. What I discovered was that I had far more power in this situation than I'd realized. This was my house, with my name on the deed and no other legal occupants. Marcus had no tenant protections because there was no lease agreement and no rent being paid. His business loan had no collateral other than his equipment and future receivables, and his current business performance was marginal at best. On Friday evening, I made my decision. I woke up early before Marcus was usually up and made myself coffee in my beautiful renovated kitchen. I sat at the table where we'd once worked on his accounts together, and I wrote out a plan. Not an emotional reaction, not a desperate ultimatum, but a clear strategic plan for reclaiming my home and my dignity. Marcus emerged around 8:30, already dressed for work, grabbing coffee and a breakfast bar on his way out of the door. This had become his routine: quick departure in the morning, late return in the evening, minimal interaction unless he needed something from me. "Marcus," I said as he headed for the door, "I need to talk to you this evening. It's important." He paused, his hand on the doorknob, and I saw a flash of something in his expression. Annoyance maybe, or impatience. "Can it wait? I've got a lot going on this week." "No," I said quietly. "It can't wait. We need to talk tonight." Something in my tone must have gotten through to him because he looked at me more carefully. "Is everything okay?" "We'll discuss it tonight." He left, and I spent the day making final preparations. I called James Morrison and asked him to draft some documents. I called Patricia Chen and moved some money around. I called Carol Williams at the bank and had an interesting conversation about loan renewals and character references, and then I waited for my son to come home. He arrived a little after 7, looking tired and slightly defensive, as if he'd been thinking about our conversation all day and decided he didn't like where it might be going. "So what's this about?" he asked, dropping his work bag by the door and heading for the refrigerator. "Sit down, Marcus." "Mom, I'm hungry, and I have paperwork to—" "Sit down." There was something in my voice that stopped him cold. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I think he saw something he hadn't expected. Maybe it was the way I was sitting, straight and composed in my own kitchen chair, or maybe it was the way I was looking at him, direct and unwavering. but something made him close the refrigerator door and take a seat across from me. Marcus, no, I said, do you know what you did to me this morning? What do you mean? This morning I needed to use the bathroom. Do you remember what happened? He shifted uncomfortably. Mom, if this is about the bathroom scheduling, we can work something out. You made me beg, I said quietly. You made me stand outside a bathroom door in my own house and beg for permission to use it. You made me wait 40 minutes while you took a leisurely shower, and then you told me I should have asked nicely. I didn't make you. You made me beg for basic human dignity in the house I own, Marcus. The house where you live for free. The house where I've been supporting your business for 18 months without charging you rent or utilities or food costs. His face was starting to change, the defensive irritation shifting toward something that might have been alarm. And that made me think, I continued, about a lot of things. About how we got to this point. About what this arrangement has really cost me. About what it's really done for you. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared earlier and set it on the table between us. I did some research this week, Marcus, about your business, your finances, your loan situation. Would you like to know what I discovered? The color was starting to drain from his face. I discovered that your business loan is up for renewal next month. I discovered that you've been late on payments and requested extensions. I discovered that the bank has been accommodating these issues, partly because of their relationship with me. Mom, I can explain. I also discovered that you've been essentially living off my generosity to the tune of about $3,000 per month in free housing, utilities, food, and administrative support. That's $36,000 per year, Marcus. $36,000 that you've been able to put into your struggling business instead of into basic living expenses. I opened the folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. I had my attorney draw up a bill for services rendered. 18 months of rent at market rate for this area, utilities, food costs, and administrative support at minimum wage for the 20 hours per week I've been doing your scheduling and paperwork. The total comes to $68,000. Marcus was staring at the paper like it was a snake that might bite him. Now, I'm not asking you to pay me back, I said. That was my gift to you, my investment in your success. But I'm done making that investment. What do you mean? I mean, you have 30 days to find alternative housing. I'm returning this house to the quiet, peaceful home it was before you moved in. Mom, you can't be serious. Where am I supposed to go? You know I can't afford. You're a 34-year-old man with a business, Marcus. You'll figure it out. But my business will succeed or fail based on its own merits, not on my continued subsidies. He was starting to panic now. I could see it in his eyes. Mom, please. You're upset about the bathroom thing. I get it. I'm sorry about that. We can work out a better system. This isn't about the bathroom, Marcus. The bathroom was just the moment I realized what our relationship had become. You've turned me into a servant in my own home. That's not... I never meant... What you meant doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what you did, and what I'm going to do about it. I pulled out another sheet of paper. I also called the bank today, Carol Williams. She remembered you, of course. We had an interesting conversation about your loan renewal application. The panic in his eyes was turning to something that looked like terror. She mentioned that character references would be an important part of the renewal process, particularly references from family members who might have insights into your financial management and business practices. Mom, you wouldn't... I haven't decided yet what I'm going to tell them when they call. That will depend entirely on how the next 30 days go. You're blackmailing me. I'm setting boundaries. For the first time in 18 months, I'm remembering that I have choices, that I have power, that I don't have to accept being treated poorly just because someone shares my DNA. Marcus sat back in his chair, and I could see him recalculating, trying to figure out a new approach. Marcus, I said gently, your success was never my responsibility, and your failure won't be my fault. You're a grown man who needs to learn how to take care of himself without exploiting the people who love him. So that's it? You're just throwing me out? I'm giving you 30 days' notice to find alternative housing. That's more generous than most landlords would be. And Marcus, I love you. That's why I'm doing this. Because love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's fear dressed up as virtue. The next 30 days transformed both of our lives in ways I never could have anticipated. Marcus, to his credit, didn't fight the eviction. He sulked for the first week and tried a few more guilt trips, But when those didn't work, he seemed to accept that the situation had fundamentally changed. He started looking for apartments, though. He made sure I knew how expensive they all were. He found a place eventually, a small apartment about 20 minutes away, with a one-car garage and enough space for basic living. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and functional and within his budget if he managed his money carefully. "I'll finish the master bathroom before I go, Haig," he said as we packed up the last of his clothes. "I know you've been waiting to use it." And he did finish it. In the final week before his departure, he worked late every evening, installing the last fixtures, grouting the tile, painting the trim. It was beautiful work, professional quality, exactly the kind of showcase piece he'd promised it would be. On his last night in the house, we sat in the living room together, drinking coffee and watching the news like we used to do in the early days of his stay. "Mom," he said during a commercial break, "I want you to know that I never meant to make you feel like a prisoner here. I really didn't realize how bad it had gotten." "I know," I said, "and I meant it. I'm sorry about the bathroom thing. That was really not okay." "No, it wasn't." "I don't know how to be different," he said. "I don't know how to struggle without dragging other people down with me." "You learn," I said. "You make mistakes, you face consequences, and you learn. That's how everyone figures it out." "You really think I can do this? Live on my own, support myself, make the business work without using you as a safety net?" I looked at my son then, really looked at him, and for the first time in months I saw not the manipulative man-child who'd been making my life miserable, but the scared little boy who'd always been afraid of failing. "I think you're stronger than you believe you are," I said. "But more importantly, I think you need to find out for yourself." The next morning I helped him load the last of his things into his truck. We stood in the driveway for a moment, both of us uncertain about how to end this chapter of our relationship. "Mom, he said finally, "thank you. For everything. For letting me stay here, for helping with the business, for not giving up on me even when I was being impossible. You're welcome. And thank you for kicking me out. I know that sounds weird, but I think I needed someone to love me enough to stop enabling me." I hugged him then, and for the first time in months, it felt like hugging my son instead of appeasing my tenant. After he drove away, I walked back into my house and stood in the living room, listening to the silence. It was the first time in 18 months that I'd been alone in my own home, and the quiet felt like a gift. I spent the rest of that day reclaiming my space. I moved furniture back to where I liked it. I rearranged the kitchen cabinets to my preferences. I took a long, hot shower in my beautiful new master bathroom. I made myself dinner and ate it in the dining room, on real plates, with cloth napkins and a candle, because I could. The bank called 2 weeks later. Carol Williams wanted to discuss Marcus's loan renewal application and had some questions about his character and financial management. I told her the truth. That Marcus was hardworking and well-intentioned but still learning how to manage his finances responsibly. That he'd been living with family support that was ending, so he'd need to factor full living expenses into his business projections going forward. That he'd been prone to overpromising and under-delivering, but seemed to be developing more realistic expectations. "So you'd say he's a moderate risk?" Carol asked. "I'd say he's a young businessman who's still learning. Whether that's acceptable risk is your decision to make based on his actual performance and projections. In the end, the bank renewed his loan, but at a higher interest rate and with stricter reporting requirements. Marcus called to tell me about it, and he sounded more relieved than angry. "It's going to be tighter than I hoped," he said. "But it's fair. I need to prove the business can work without subsidies." 6 months later, Marcus's business was doing better than it had when he was living with me. Not dramatically better, but steadily, sustainably better. He'd learned to price his jobs more accurately, to manage his cash flow more carefully, to communicate more professionally with clients. The portfolio pieces he'd created in my house had helped him land several higher-end contracts. More importantly, our relationship was healthier than it had been in years. We had dinner together every few weeks, and he'd call to ask for advice on business decisions or just to check in. But he wasn't calling in crisis every week, wasn't expecting me to solve his problems or subsidize his mistakes. "You know what's funny," Fatih said during one of our dinners? "I always thought independence meant not needing anyone, but it's actually the opposite. It means being able to have relationships with people without needing them to take care of you." "How so?" Like, when I was living with you, I couldn't actually enjoy spending time with you because I was always worried about saying or doing something that might make you change your mind about supporting me. Everything felt like negotiation. Now, when we have dinner, it's just dinner. I'm here because I want to be, not because I need something. A year after Marcus moved out, he called to tell me he was engaged to a woman named Sarah who worked as a nurse and had her own apartment, her own car, her own life that didn't revolve around fixing him. "She's amazing, Mom," he said, and I could hear the genuine happiness in his voice. "She's strong and independent, and she doesn't put up with any of my nonsense. When I try to make my problems her problems, she just looks at me and says, 'What are you going to do about that?' She sounds perfect for you." She is. And Mom, I don't think I could have been ready for someone like her if you hadn't forced me to learn how to take care of myself first. The dinner with Marcus and Sarah was a revelation. She was exactly as he had described. Strong, independent, warm, but not accommodating. Someone who clearly loved him but wasn't willing to lose herself in that love. She treated me like Eleanor, a person in my own right, not just Marcus's mother. "Marcus told me about the bathroom situation," she said with the kind of directness I'd come to appreciate. "I have to say, I respect what you did. It would have been easier to just keep enabling him, but easier isn't always better." At their wedding 6 months later, Marcus asked me to dance, and as we moved slowly around the floor, he said something that brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you for teaching me how to be worthy of this," he said, nodding toward his new wife. "If you hadn't made me learn how to take care of myself, I never could have learned how to take care of someone else. You always had it in you, Marcus. You just needed room to find it." Maybe. But I needed you to stop filling up all the space where that growth was supposed to happen. 2 years after the bathroom incident that changed everything, I was planning a trip to Italy when Marcus called with news that his business had landed its biggest contract ever, a 6-month renovation project for a luxury condo development. "How did you land something that big?" I asked. "Portfolio pieces, including the bathroom I did for you. They saw the photos and called me in for a consultation. I'm so proud of you. But that's not the main thing I wanted to tell you," he said. "I wanted to tell you that I know this wouldn't have happened if you hadn't kicked me out. If you'd kept supporting me, I never would have learned how to run a real business. You were working hard even when you lived here." I was working, but I wasn't learning. I wasn't growing. You gave me the gift of having to figure it out on my own. It didn't feel like a gift at the time. No, I imagine it felt pretty terrible. But you did it anyway, because you loved me enough to let me fail if that's what I needed to do. I did it because I loved myself enough to stop being exploited, even by someone I adore. The fact that it ended up helping you was a happy accident." Marcus laughed. "Leave it to my mother to be completely honest about her motivations, even when I'm trying to give her credit for being a parenting genius." When I look back now on that terrible morning when I stood outside my own bathroom door, begging for permission to enter, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel gratitude. Gratitude for the moment of clarity that cut through months of confusion and self-doubt. Gratitude for the strength I found to act on that clarity, even when it meant hurting someone I loved in service of helping him grow. The bathroom door that wouldn't open became the door that opened everything else. My eyes to what my life had become, my heart to what it could be again, my hands to the power I'd always possessed, but had forgotten how to use. 3 years later, I was living the life Paul and I had planned for me to have after he was gone, independent, adventurous, full of new experiences. I'd taken painting classes in Tuscany, learned photography in New Mexico, and started volunteering at a local women's shelter, helping other women navigate the legal and financial aspects of leaving abusive situations. "You have a gift for this," Margaret, the shelter director, told me one afternoon after I'd helped a client understand her options for protecting her assets during a divorce. "You know how to be supportive without being patronizing, how to share your strength without taking over." I learned the hard way that you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, but you can show them that saving themselves is possible. The work drew on everything I'd learned about boundaries and self-worth, about the difference between helping and enabling, about the courage required to save yourself when saving yourself feels like betraying everyone you love. I shared my story with other women who were struggling with similar issues. Adult children who'd become too dependent, family members who'd learned to weaponize love against them. "My name is Eleanor Davidson," I would begin when speaking at workshops, and 3 years ago I was a prisoner in my own home, not because of an abusive husband or a dangerous neighborhood, but because I'd allowed my adult son to gradually take control of my life in the name of helping him get back on his feet. During one workshop, a woman raised her hand and asked, "But how do you know when you're helping and when you're enabling?" "Ask yourself this," I said. "Is your help making them stronger or weaker? Is it moving them toward independence or toward greater dependence on you? Is it teaching them to solve their own problems or teaching them that someone else will always be there to solve problems for them?" Another woman asked, "What if they get angry? What if they cut you out of their life?" "Then you'll know something important about the relationship you actually had," I said. If someone's love for you disappears the moment you stop sacrificing yourself for their benefit, it was never really love to begin with. It was just convenience. These conversations reminded me of how isolated I'd felt during my own experience with Marcus, how much I doubted my perceptions and my right to have boundaries, but they also reminded me of how empowering it had been to reclaim my own life, how much stronger and happier I'd become once I'd stopped allowing my worth to be determined by my usefulness to others. 4 years after Marcus moved out, he and Sarah had their first baby, a beautiful little girl named Emma. When Marcus called to tell me about the pregnancy, I felt the old familiar tug of maternal instinct, the urge to immediately offer help and support. But I'd learned to pause before responding to those impulses. "We're excited, but also terrified," May said. "We weren't expecting it quite this soon, and the timing is challenging financially." "What kind of challenges are you facing?" I asked. "Sarah's going to have to take maternity leave, and her employer only offers 6 weeks of paid leave. We've been trying to save money, but the down payment on our house took most of our savings." "That sounds stressful. What's your plan?" "We've cut our expenses as much as we can. I've taken on some extra weekend projects. Sarah's looking into part-time, work-from-home options. We've researched all the financial assistance programs available for new parents." "So you've been planning and preparing, not just hoping someone else will solve the problem for you." "Exactly. We want to handle this ourselves, but we also know that having a baby is expensive, and we're still building our financial stability." "What specifically are you asking for?" "Would you be willing to help with some of the baby gear, maybe the crib or car seat? And would you be interested in providing childcare 1 or 2 days a week once Sarah goes back to work?" This was entirely different from the old dynamic. Marcus was asking for specific help with specific needs, and clearly stating that this was about temporary assistance during a transition, not ongoing support for poor life management. "I'd be happy to help with some of the baby expenses," Vijay said, "and I'd love to provide childcare. Taking care of my grandchild would be a joy, not a burden." "Thank you, Mom. This means a lot to us." "You're welcome. And Marcus, I'm proud of how you're handling this. You're facing a challenge together, making realistic plans and asking for help without expecting someone else to solve your problems for you." 9 months later, I was holding Emma for the first time, marveling at her tiny, perfect fingers and the way she seemed to look directly at me with those serious newborn eyes. Marcus and Sarah had handled the pregnancy and birth with remarkable maturity, making decisions together, preparing practically and emotionally for parenthood. The months that followed were some of the most rewarding of my life. 2 days a week, I would go to their house to take care of Emma while they were at work. But this wasn't the desperate, exhausting childcare I'd provided for my own children while juggling a household and marriage and financial stress. This was the pure joy of grandparenthood, all the love and wonder of being with a baby, but with the security of knowing that the ultimate responsibility belonged to her parents. Marcus and Sarah were thoughtful, engaged parents who'd prepared for the realities of having a child. When they asked for advice, it was because they genuinely wanted my perspective, not because they expected me to make their decisions for them. "How did you manage the sleep deprivation when we were babies?" Sarah asked one afternoon when she was looking particularly exhausted. "Badly," I said honestly. "I was trying to be perfect, trying to do everything myself, trying to prove I was a good mother by never asking for help. It made everything harder than it needed to be." "What would you do differently?" "I'd accept more help. I'd sleep when the baby slept instead of trying to keep the house perfect. I'd remember that being a good mother doesn't mean being a martyr. It means taking care of yourself so you can take care of your child. It's hard not to feel guilty when you're tired or frustrated. Feeling tired and frustrated is normal. Wanting a break is normal. You're not supposed to love every minute of motherhood. You're supposed to love your child and do your best to care for her, but that doesn't mean enjoying every sleepless night and crying fit." "That's why boundaries are so important, even with your own children," I continued. "Emma needs a mother who takes care of herself, who maintains her own identity, who models self-respect and healthy relationships. She doesn't need a martyr. She needs a whole person. 5 years after the bathroom incident that changed everything, I received an invitation that surprised me. Marcus asked me to be the keynote speaker at a conference for small business owners about family dynamics and professional success. I want you to tell your story, Raquel, he said when he called to ask, about what it looks like when family support becomes family dysfunction, and how setting boundaries can actually save relationships instead of destroying them. Are you sure you want me to talk publicly about our situation? I'm positive. Mom, our story could help other people recognize unhealthy patterns before they get as bad as ours did. And it could help business owners understand that accepting help from family comes with responsibilities, not just to be grateful, but to be respectful. The conference was larger than I'd expected, filled with entrepreneurs and small business owners who were navigating the complex dynamics of family-supported ventures. I stood at the podium looking out at an audience of people who might be struggling with the same issues Marcus and I had faced. My name is Eleanor Davidson, I began, and 5 years ago, my adult son's business was failing. My relationship with him was toxic, and I was a prisoner in my own home. Today, his business is thriving, our relationship is healthier than it's ever been, and I'm living the most independent, fulfilling life I've ever known. The difference wasn't that his business got better. The difference was that I learned to love him without enabling him, and he learned to accept help without exploiting it. I told them about the 18 months of gradual control, about the bathroom incident that had finally opened my eyes, about the difficult conversation that had led to Marcus moving out. I told them about the bank loan that had given me leverage I didn't know I had, about the way setting boundaries had ultimately saved our relationship. The hardest lesson I had to learn, I said, was that helping someone shouldn't require sacrificing yourself. The hardest lesson Marcus had to learn was that accepting help comes with the responsibility to treat your supporters with respect and gratitude, not entitlement and control. During the question and answer session, a young woman raised her hand. I'm in a similar situation with my brother. He moved in 6 months ago to get his startup off the ground, but he's basically taken over my apartment and treats me like his assistant. How do I know if I'm being supportive or being taken advantage of? Ask yourself this, I said. Does your support make him more capable or less capable? Oui, will. Does it move him toward independence or toward greater dependence on you? Does he treat your help as a gift to be appreciated or as a service he's entitled to receive? He definitely treats it like I owe it to him because we're family. Then you have your answer. Family obligation doesn't include allowing yourself to be exploited. Love doesn't require the sacrifice of your own dignity and autonomy. But what if he fails without my support? Then he'll learn something important about himself and his business, and you'll learn something important about the difference between supporting someone's growth and enabling their dysfunction. After the conference, Marcus found me in the lobby. He looked proud but also slightly emotional. Thank you for doing that, he said. I know it wasn't easy to talk about our lowest point in front of strangers. It wasn't our lowest point, I said. Our lowest point was when we were both pretending that what was happening was normal and healthy. Today was actually a celebration of how far we've both come. I love you, Mom, and I'm grateful every day that you loved me enough to save both of us. I love you too, Marcus, and I'm grateful that you learned to be worthy of that love. As I drove home from the conference, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 5 years ago, I'd been a woman who'd lost herself in the service of others, who'd confused self-sacrifice with love, who'd been so afraid of being alone that she'd accepted being diminished. Today, I was a woman who understood her own worth, who could love others without losing herself, who had built a life of dignity and purpose and joy. I had meaningful work that drew on my experience and wisdom. I had a healthy relationship with my son that was based on mutual respect rather than need or obligation. I had friendships and interests and adventures that belonged entirely to me. The bathroom door that wouldn't open had led to this. A life where every door was mine to open or close as I chose, where my choices served my growth and happiness, where my love for others enhanced rather than diminished my love for myself. Sometimes salvation comes disguised as humiliation. Sometimes freedom begins with recognizing your own imprisonment. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened, because it forces you to remember who you are and what you deserve. I deserved dignity. I deserved respect. I deserved to live in my own home without asking permission for basic human needs. And so do you. Whatever bathroom door won't open in your life, whatever permission you're asking for that you shouldn't need to ask for, whatever boundaries you've allowed to be crossed in the name of family harmony or keeping the peace. You have more power than you think you do. You have the power to say no. You have the power to set limits. You have the power to choose your own well-being without guilt or apology. You have the power to save yourself. And sometimes when you find the courage to save yourself, you discover that was the only way to save everyone else too. Real love, the kind that actually helps people grow, sometimes requires you to step back and let people struggle. It requires you to care more about their long-term development than their short-term comfort. It requires the courage to risk their temporary anger in service of their permanent growth. Being a good mother doesn't mean being an endless source of rescue and accommodation. It means being strong enough to let your children discover their own strength, wise enough to know when helping becomes hurting, brave enough to save yourself when saving yourself is the only way to save your family. I learned that lesson at 67, which might seem late in life for such fundamental wisdom. But perhaps some lessons can only be learned when you've lived long enough to understand the difference between what feels loving and what actually is loving, between what looks like kindness and what truly serves the people you care about. The woman who stood outside that bathroom door, begging for permission to enter, taught me everything I needed to know about dignity, boundaries, and the courage required to claim your own life. I honor her by never forgetting how it felt to lose herself, and by never allowing it to happen again. That morning, I couldn't open a door in my own home. Today, every door is mine to open, and I choose to walk through them with my head high, my heart full, and my dignity intact. That's the gift that came wrapped in humiliation, the gift of remembering who I am and what I deserve, and the strength to demand nothing less than both.